Hey everyone, I've got one for you mystery fans out there. Changing gears a little bit by the recent recommendation of one of my viewers, well, not so recent at this point, but also just by my general interest in reading some mysteries from writers other than Agatha Christie. I'm going to talk today about A Man Lay Dead by Ngaio Marsh. Ngaio Marsh would eventually become one of the queens of crime of the golden age of detective fiction, a group that included Agatha Christie herself, and Marsh was in fact inspired by reading Christie to start writing her own mysteries, of which this is her very first one. By my understanding, all 32 of her mystery novels are featuring the same inspector, Roderick Allen, who makes his first appearance in this book. This is also my first introduction to Inspector Allen. Marsh definitely knows how to draw in the reader. Although some readers might not find Marsh's first novel, which takes place in a country estate, to be particularly unique or memorable in its setting, I found there was something in the writing that painted a very nice picture of the host, Sir Hubert Hansley's estate, inside and out. Accurate or not, I have a very clear picture of the place, like down to the arrangement of the rooms, an entrance hall with the collector's showcase of weapons adorning the walls, an imposing staircase leading up to a hallway where the guests' bedrooms are all located, and so on. Which, I'm not sure what it is about a description in a novel that paints this sort of picture for me, or doesn't, but I do think it's really important to get this first impression right to get the reader interested. And in some ways, this country estate setting is evocative of Agatha Christie's own first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, making it tempting for me to draw comparisons throughout this review, but I'm going to try to restrain myself there and just consider Marsh on her own. The murder scenario here is somewhat interesting or gimmicky or both, somewhat akin to the murder hunt that would eventually feature in Agatha Christie's Dead Man's Folly. The party host, Sir Hubert Hansley, has invited a group of his friends to his house for the weekend and has announced that there will be a murder game taking place. You may have played something like this yourself before, although not quite in this form. Basically, all the guests go about their business as usual during the visit, but then one guest is handed a slip of paper, I think, at dinner on the first night, by the butler indicating that he or she is the murderer. And that guest has all evening to select a victim, get them alone, and murder them by telling them, "You are the corpse," turning out all the lights and striking a gong standing at a central location. How could this possibly go wrong? Well, you know what this book is about, so you can imagine. But I'll leave it to you to read and discover the exact circumstances for yourself. Bottom line is, when the lights go out, there's an actual victim who is indeed very dead. I found this novel fun to read overall, but by the end, it didn't really deliver for me as I'd hoped. While the opening is strong enough, I think we lose the main thread towards the late middle of the novel, and the mystery plot needed to be tighter here. It reads very much like a first novel, which it is, in that there are a lot of good ideas present, but it feels like the author is still trying to figure out how to fit these ideas together and use some amount of restraint in making a tractable mystery plot. Not to mention, you can get the sense that Marsh was struggling to reach the right page count here based on some of the side plots she throws in, all of which are far less intriguing than the main murder storyline. Nevertheless, the good ideas are there, and the novel in its best moments really is suspenseful and captivating. And the character descriptions are on par with an above-average Agatha Christie novel. Yes, they have something of the stock character to them, but several of them interested me well beyond a first superficial description. Nigel Bathgate, a bit of a doofus, and therefore a good point of view character, is well done, partly because through his naivete and the way the other characters respond to him, we learn a bit more about the other characters as well. Angela North, an independent and no-nonsense young woman, also is a strong character from her first dramatic appearance to the very end. Mr. and Mrs. Wilde make a compelling, if often distraught, pair, each with a clear sense of character coming through. Hubert Hansley, the host of the party, is a man who enjoys a good spectacle and takes pride in being the one bringing others together through his hospitality and generosity. And Dr. Tokarev, the Russian doctor, I did find him an interesting and clearly drawn character. This is an eccentric man who sings loudly in his room for all the other guests to hear, and reads from the dictionary every morning to improve his English and expand his vocabulary, even though from a modern reader's vantage point, all the Russian characters, including Dr. Tokarev, ultimately play into certain unflattering stereotypes. Most of all, though, the victim, Charles Rankin, before he's bumped off in the third or fourth chapter, has already established his character as someone who we can understand why several of those present would have wanted to kill him, just based on how he treats people. There's also Rosamund Grant. Maybe I missed something, but she just didn't interest me that much, despite being an important character and a suspect. Oh yeah, and Inspector Allen. He's not bad. I haven't quite gotten my finger on him yet. I think he's less of an immediate standout than some of the other characters, but we do get to see some of his character in this novel. He's a bit unorthodox, but not simply for the show of being unorthodox in the way that Hercule Poirot often is. He's a bit Holmesian in the sense that it's not beneath him to crawl around sniffing for clues on occasion, and he does find something to learn both in the more conventional sorts of clues as well as some of the more unusual inferences. And as with the best of detectives from these stories, he's enigmatic enough to keep things a mystery, but divulges enough information so as not to leave the narrator or the reader completely in the dark. He works from within the police system and has several trusted assistants who are competent, though not as deductively strong as him, and thus he's also a figure of a central authority, putting him in contrast with someone like Miss Marple, who's an amateur but so good that she has to be taken seriously, even if not always given full credit. Honestly, though, none of this really quite gets at establishing his character. It's just telling how he is or isn't similar to other detectives I've read, so maybe it's going to take some time for us to really get to know him, I guess. Maybe the most interesting character element I've seen of him so far is that he walks a sort of fine line in self-confidence where we'll see to what extent this holds up as I read more of him, but he seems acutely aware that he's the best in his game and will even say as much, but doesn't seem particularly concerned at whether others recognize this feature in the way that Mr. Hercule Poirot is, for example. At times he's actually a bit self-deprecating in a way where other characters wonder if he's being serious, although it seems he actually is. This might be because of that place of authority he occupies. He's not a person who has to sit slyly smiling to himself on the side because he knows the answer but no one has bothered to ask him yet. On the contrary, he's the chief inspector. He's the first person everyone is going to ask. I'm going to get into spoilers in a second, but before I do, I'll just summarize my thoughts. All in all, this novel was actually a miss for me, and yet even as I say that, I wonder if I'm being too critical there, because there were aspects to this novel that I really enjoyed. I also saw from this novel that Marsh clearly has potential as a detective writer, so this novel by no means dissuaded me from reading anything else by her. In fact, on the contrary, I pretty much immediately began the next novel in the series because I was excited to give her another chance. This in itself makes me wonder if I'm being too critical in saying it was a miss, but let's just say it was a soft miss if it was one, and I certainly wouldn't dissuade anyone from reading it, or even starting with this one as an introduction to Roderick Allen, since it is, after all, the first one in the series. Alright, to the spoiling now. Leave if you still want to read and be surprised, or stay if you want the gory details. And the killer is Arthur Wilde, who, despite seeming to be in the bathtub during the entire time window of the murder, actually managed to cleverly create this impression while dashing off for a few seconds, sliding down the banister face first, which I didn't even know was possible, grabbing the rare Russian dagger off the display wall on his way down, seizing the unwitting Charles Rankin and driving a dagger through his back and into his heart, which is made out to be quite the feat by our detectives, and I kind of believe it. And then flipping off the light switch before the dying Rankin stumbles headfirst into the gong used to signal in the game that the murder has been committed, and then scrambling back up through the dark into the shower where he can start washing off the blood immediately and call across to Nigel in the neighboring room, what's going on? That's actually really impressive. Like, of all of the murder mysteries I've read, this is probably the murder that took the most mechanical skill and coordination to pull it off. We're not talking poison in the cocktail right here, ladies and gentlemen. This must be an excellent scene if there is a film version of this novel. So I actually guessed who the killer was, and I do have to say guessed on this one, because although I could see some of the false assumptions being made here, and therefore suspected they might later be proven wrong, the actual means of committing the crime was pretty far-fetched, even by the author's own later admission, and a lot of silly coincidences were involved as well, like the victim's head banging into the gong that was meant to signal the murder had occurred within the game. I did from the start question, though, whether the unreliable Nigel Bathgate was really correct in his assumption that he'd been talking with Arthur Wilde, who was in the bathtub the entire time that this scene was taking place. And similarly, Wilde's artificial confession halfway through the novel felt a little clunky to me, like on his behalf, not on the author's behalf. I didn't quite pick up that it was for the money that this crime was committed, although I did notice that he was to inherit some of the money. It seemed that Wilde had several possible sufficient motives, though, among them that Rankin was having an affair with his wife and that Rankin had bullied him in front of other guests, which one could imagine was not the first of a series of humiliations by his friend. So he had ample motivation for committing this crime from an emotional perspective as well as from monetary gain. I also had my suspicions for a while focused on Hubert Hansley, the host himself. It was the motive that came up a bit short. Hansley's only motive would have been to claim this rare antique dagger for himself, which, as much as he clearly wanted it, still seems overboard to me. Especially because the whole idea that someone would plan a murder game in their own house and then on a whim the day before decide to carry out a real murder to get one of the guests' valuables? This seemed to me highly unlikely. In the end, the fact that the murder took place within this scenario of a murder game doesn't seem to be used to its fullest advantage here. It's a clever gimmick to pull the reader in at first, but then it kind of fizzles out by the end. Really, the most notable bearing it has on the mystery plot seems to be the fact that it gives the clever Arthur Wilde a chance to further divert attention away from himself by pretending he doesn't know what's going on and taking advantage of the not yet discovered actual murder to commit the murder within the game. By telling another person at the party that he is the corpse. But there were plenty of other possibilities here. For example, when Wilde comes out as the in-game murderer around the time Vasily the butler disappears, I certainly was wondering about what was happening here, since Vasily was the only one to actually know who'd been assigned the role. He had handed the role to Wilde. Had Wilde not actually been assigned the role and just claimed to be the one? Had he secretly arranged with Vasily to give him the role because he wanted it, or to give Charles Rankin the role? There were lots of interesting possibilities here regarding the lack of complete information about the game itself, but such speculations die once Vasily turns up safe and sound, and therefore, unless he's in on the murder, we have to take Arthur Wilde at his word that he really was the designated murderer in the game. So then the murder game becomes simply not that important in the final solution. To make this point, imagine a story with the exact same plot, except that whole murder game was just completely eliminated from it. There's no game, there's just an actual murder where the lights go out and a gong is struck. It would have been less suspenseful and probably less interesting at the beginning, I'll give it that, but it also would have only had the slightest effect on the overall mystery plot. Same with the dagger, for that matter. That one's a little more important, but it's actually not essential at all, besides as an alternate motive for the crime. The fact that Rankin brought the weapon used to murder him actually turns out to be irrelevant, since the dagger was hanging on a wall apparently full of displayed weapons, so the murderer could have taken his pick even if the Russian dagger hadn't conveniently appeared the day before to be temporarily hung on the wall. I did have some suspicions for a while that the murder weapon had actually been sent to Charles Rankin, the victim, by one of the other guests. The origin of the dagger wasn't really traceable, and it wasn't at all clear that it was really from the person Rankin thought it was from. And we know that Charles Rankin is always telling all sorts of stories about himself at dinner parties, so we can imagine that people who frequently attend parties with him have heard this story about how he's rescued some Russian from a crevasse in Switzerland or something like that. I can absolutely imagine a scenario in which someone, quite possibly Arthur Wilde, sent Rankin this dagger, knowing that he was very likely to bring it to this party with other collectors present, including the obsessive Hubert Hansley. And then when they murdered Rankin at this party, they would know that the jealous Hansley would receive at least some amount of suspicion. A little far-fetched, of course, but maybe not more than the actual solution. I also wondered early on whether it could have been Hansley who sent Rankin the dagger himself, since Hansley would be the most likely to possess such an item to begin with, but there was never any subsequent evidence that really came out supporting that, so I dropped it. So the mystery plot definitely kept me interested, but I can't say it was the most elegantly crafted or the most elegantly solved. These mystery tropes are there, but it feels the author hasn't quite mastered their use yet, and thus they do create suspense, but don't contribute much to some final ingenious solution. Also, the pacing in the third quarter or so of this novel really drags in a way that, unfortunately for me, had gotten me bored by the time the actual ending arrived. In this part of the novel, the Russian element of the mystery is revealed to us, and beyond even the sort of implicit racism and caricatures of Russians that we get throughout the novel, this part just wasn't that interesting. And all of this even happens after a character goes as far as to say, we have two Russians at the same house, and you're telling me that both of them turn up to be caught in secret brotherhoods? It sounds like you've been reading too many spy novels, except actually that is true here. This casual statement reads as if the author knows how ridiculous it is and is begging her readers to let it slide. But all in all, by the end of this novel, the mystery unfortunately feels like it would have been better as maybe a novella than a full-length novel, because there just isn't enough here to sustain what already is not actually that long of a novel. But that's how it is sometimes, and this novel really isn't bad. I actually look forward to exploring some more stories by Ngaio Marsh. I'm sure if I wrote detective novels, I wouldn't have figured it out all on the first try, and I see a lot of potential there. So, that's a wrap. Happy reading.